Hello. I'm pleased to be talking about how system theory helps modeling and simulation close the gap between cognition and neuron level modeling. My name is Bernard Ziegler. I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Arizona, currently chief scientist at RT-Sync Corp, a spin-off from the University of Arizona. To give you an outline of the talk, despite significant advances in fields from neurophysiology to cognitive science, a wide gap remains between cognition and neural substrate. The Debs modeling abstraction characterizes neural elements having states, processing messages, and coordinating in space and time. Thus, Debs offers a general system-theoretic computational modeling formalism to link the levels. In this talk, we discuss cognitive computation behaviors and provide Debs models that generate these behaviors and prove them with simulations. System theory and automata helps to prove that these are minimal realizations. We show here a formulation of system specification formalisms as done in a recent edition of Theory of Modeling and Simulation. Debs holds a special place in this hierarchy where Debs can simulate a system, where the systems are basic ways of algorithmic formulation of input-output behavior, and there are various specific types of system specification, and Debs can simulate these forms of specification, and is in turn one of them itself. These concepts for systems and system specification play a major role in underlying the framework for modeling and simulation that was formulated early on in the theory of modeling and simulation. There are levels of system specification ranging from observation level and input-output behavior that can be observed to increasingly higher structural levels that incorporate more and more knowledge about the internals of the system, including the states and the coordinates and couplings of these components. These system levels underlie the different basic entities in modeling and simulation, such as the source system, the model, and the simulator, and the experimental frame that captures the interest in the system that we're expressing in order to build the model. These entities themselves are related by relations that are formulations of preservation of what is preserved in going from one model or simulator or system to the next. All these components are represented as systems in the system theory. Corresponding to levels of system specification, there are associated levels of morphisms that relate to systems specified at each level. At the lowest level, we are concerned with just how the interfaces match up. At the next level, whether the behaviors agree, and so on as we get up to higher structural levels. Normally, modeling concerns the rising and climbing from lower levels with only data known to higher levels. And these climbing up these levels can be justified by conditions that allow such inferences to be made. One form of such inference is minimal realization, which which we'll be talking about today. And on the other side, simulation is descending from higher levels of structure to lower levels of behavior as generated by models. The approach we want to discuss today is based on structural inference, climbing up levels of the system specification hierarchy. We see that we have behavior at the cognitive level that we'd like to model and relate to actual data and the structure in the real system of the brain. So we formulate these behaviors as I/O functions at the lowest or near lowest levels, and then try to find models that will generate these functions, and then try to implement these models in network form and validate them with dev simulation. Structural inference allows us to try to show that these models are minimal, have the fewest states possible, and therefore form a minimality constraint in the sense that any model that we look for must have the same kind of transitions. An example of this approach is the self-organizing neural nets that implement certain operations at a macro level that require complex protocols at the individual cell or micro level. One such critical operation assumes that given an input such as a facial image, the first and second neurons closest to the input recognition space can identify themselves. This operation is easy to perform for a global algorithm, but not so for a local algorithm that requires collaboration between different individual neurons. As an instance of our approach, we consider the inter-cell signal exchange needed to establish the node pair that is closest to an input vector. The idea is that neurons must form classes that cluster around inputs that are closely spaced together, and neurons therefore must decide initially which neuron and second neuron are closest to a particular input vector as it arrives. Here is a Dev's atomic model for a typical neuron node in this collection of nodes that are interacting with each other. You can see that this represents a fairly complex protocol where we have various states required, various signals that drive from one state to another, receiving input and producing output. And also that timing is involved, holding in states for various times and having timeouts when certain events do not occur. Judging the order of arrival plays a key role in the protocol just looked at. So we formulate that as a problem by itself. We consider two discrete events, x and y, that occur in a time interval. We represent the perception of order as a function that maps event segments into a value at the end of the interval. A minimal requirement is that the function be able to distinguish the order y after x from other possibilities, such as x after y or x and y happening simultaneously. We formulate this computation as an I/O function behavior in the Dev's formalism and provide a realization at the state level for it. We We then show that this is a minimal realization and therefore characteristic of any biological realization of such behavior. Let's do a quick formalization of what computation and behavior means in this context. We consider a mapping from input segments to a final value at the end of the segment, such that in the case of order of occurrence, that x occurs before y produces a value of 1, and other orders do not. Here's the Dev's atomic model that realizes the full order of arrival behavior. You can see it has various states for recognizing the arrival of y after x in the interval, or whether x occurs alone in the interval, and so on, such as no events occurring or even simultaneous events occurring requires full devs rather than just state level description of devs. Let's consider the simplest case of whether or not y follows x. Shown here is the Dev's model for that, where we wait for the input. If it's an x, we go to the state that records that x arrival, then wait for a y. If a y occurs, then we output a signal to say that y has been recognized after x. So this is a function of beta that's 1 precisely if there are two events, x and y, in the interval, and x occurs before y and 0 otherwise. I'll go through a quick illustration of how the model we just looked at is a minimal realization of the simple function that we discussed. This is using derivatives of a function as explained in the reference below. You construct a tree of sequences and decide on which sequences are equivalent based on the subsequent values of the function, and then you minimize collecting all states that are equivalent into single states, and this gives you an equivalent simplified minimal model. Let's consider a third instance of our approach where we're detecting bursts in a neural spike train, where bursts are closely spaced spikes, and bursts are separated by a long enough interval to separate the two or different bursts. We can have a Dev's model that can detect such bursts, and it uses timing for the inner spike arrivals and for the inner burst times to make these recognitions. Going back to our approach, let's define the burst computation and behavior as we did before as a function that maps input segments into final values. Here we see that it needs to really take timing into account. We have to distinguish no events, one event occurring burst, which is a multiple of events that are closely spaced, sufficiently close together, and isolated events that do not satisfy that kind of requirement. As before, we can construct a minimal realization for such a computation, and in this case, the tree consists of segments rather than sequences, and we have to take account of individual events and their individual relationships in time with each other. To capture this requirement of an inter-spike arrival, let's formulate a model called an elementary perception unit. It's a Debs model that can distinguish arrival of pairs of spikes where a spike first arrives and then a second spike must arrive within the allotted time interval to be considered as close enough to continue looking for subsequent earlier arrivals. We have a model of such a system working shown in the sim viewer where we can inject spikes and see if subsequent spikes arrive within the allowed time interval or not, and the model produces the expected kinds of recognition. We can cascade these EPUs together in sequence to detect burst-like event sequences where the output of the first EPU is sent to the second one to activate it to look for a subsequent spike, and so on, where this cascade of spikes and activations can proceed from left to right. If at any point a spike takes too long to follow its preceding brother, then the EPU alerts the output, and that means that this no longer represents a full burst. As a final instance of the approach, we can consider realization of regular languages at finite state and network levels. We have a language over an alphabet that can be recognized by a finite state machine, and we can implement that in a network of Debs recognizers or generators put together in the same kind of manner we just discussed. Hopefully it's clear that the computational behaviors of neural elements and nets are most directly represented in the Debs formalism. For example, neural elements send and receive discrete signals. They include discrete states, and they have memory that is involved, and events play a fundamental role. Often statistical stochastic representation is needed in addition, which is part of the Debs formalism. And these interactions of neurons are modeled by Deb's coupled models, and the stochastic level is represented by semi-Markov models. Going now to the highest level of structure specification in the Deb's formalism, we can consider hierarchical modular brain network architectures, where we have at any level the input-output coupling of the Deb's coupled models, and those are coupled together to create higher level coupled models. But in addition, we have activation and reset coupling that's necessary to coordinate the different activities of these neural elements. Let's summarize and offer some conclusions. We've seen that system theory provides a framework for structural inference as climbing up levels of system specification aided by justifying conditions, such as the minimality realization at the state level. These justifying conditions allowed us to assert that the elementary perception unit is a homomorphic image of any realization of event-based detection. In this sense, this unit represents the states and transitions that must be found in any plausible biological realization of such behavior. This leads to questions such as, are there brain elements with distinctive input ports or equivalents to be activated, receive input, and reset to the ground state? Are there output ports for downstream activation and signaling of missed deadlines? Are there brain elements for detection and reporting of non-event interburst durations? Does the brain host pattern series composition coupling structures, such as the daisy chain example of the EPUs, with event and non-event detection to coordinate activities and recognize groups of spikes and of language elements in a broader interpretation. So system theory and such can aid computer science and modeling and simulation with new approaches to understanding brains and nature in general. Here are some books and literature and links to recent work in ResearchGate on this topic of structural inference and how we might be able to discover truly minimal elements